were children born into bondage, stripped not only of freedom, but of their futures, their bodies, even their manhood. Hidden behind the origins of American wealth lies a horrifying practice, the castration of enslaved boys, carried out in secrecy and silence. These boys were prized as obedient household servants or prized breeding stock, their pain buried in unmarked graves and erased from public memory. Before we uncover this chilling, untold chapter of American history, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell. Our channel unearths the stories no one wants you to know, stories that expose the dark truths beneath the foundations of this nation. In the warm stillness of a southern plantation, beyond the scent of sugarcane and magnolia trees, a different silence lingered, one steeped in pain, shame, and hidden brutality. Among the hundreds of thousands enslaved in early America, there were boys whose stories were never told. These were not just victims of labor and racism, but of deliberate mutilation. They were castrated, stripped of their reproductive organs, their futures erased before they had a chance to begin. This wasn't a tale of accident or rare cruelty. It was, in certain households, a calculated practice, kept quiet and carried out in the name of order, obedience, and utility. While most enslaved men were prized for their strength and sent to toil in the fields, certain boys were chosen for a different role: house servants, close aides, or attendants. For some enslavers, that proximity, especially to white women or children, was seen as dangerous. The solution, they believed, was permanent, surgical, dehumanizing. The stories were rarely written, but they lived in the shadows of oral history and whispers between generations. In South Carolina, Georgia, and parts of Virginia, there were recorded instances, however veiled, of young enslaved boys being mutilated either before puberty or during early adolescence. Why? Because a castrated boy was thought to be more docile, less of a threat to the enslaver's daughters, less likely to rebel, and easier to keep for indoor duties. Some were sent to doctors. Others, horrifyingly, were cut with crude instruments in barns or behind smokehouses, without anesthesia or antiseptics. Survival was not guaranteed. Infection, hemorrhage, and shock claimed many lives. But those who lived faced a different fate, a life without control over their bodies, their manhood stripped away, often left infertile, broken, and shunned. Plantation records rarely use the word castrated. Instead, enslavers used terms like cut, fixed, or more euphemistically, trained. In rare cases, insurance records listed enslaved boys with alterations as a risk factor for depreciation or early death. One document from an 1832 Louisiana plantation referred to a 13-year-old boy as gelded, alongside notations about his duties in the master's quarters. One can only imagine what that boy endured and how little regard was paid to his humanity. In even more disturbing twists, some were made into symbols. Like ancient eunuchs of empires past, they were presented in pristine suits, taught manners and European customs, then paraded as model servants. Their mutilation became part of their performance. They served dinner, dressed their owners, and were praised for their quietness, because the trauma had stolen their voices. Others were simply cast aside. Unable to reproduce, they held no future economic value as breeders. They were often denied family life, kept from other enslaved people, or made to live in small quarters alone. Sometimes they were mocked or labeled as unnatural. The psychological damage was devastating. Self-worth destroyed, identity warped, lives dictated entirely by another's whim. What's even more haunting is that this horror went unchallenged, not because people didn't know, but because society didn't care. These were black boys, property, objects. The law protected their owners, not them. There was no legal recourse, no court to appeal to. And because it was done in secret, and never spoken of publicly. It disappeared from textbooks, from archives, from the national memory. But fragments remain. In WPA slave narratives collected in the 1930s, older survivors sometimes hinted at these practices without naming them. One woman from Mississippi recounted how a boy she grew up with never became a man, and how he stopped speaking after being sent to the big house for special training. A former enslaved man from Alabama said plainly, "They cut that boy so he wouldn't breed." He never was right again. And those stories, those voices, are why we cannot look away. It's not just a lesson in brutality. It's a glimpse into how control over labor, over identity, over bodies, was wielded like a weapon by slave owners. And it is also a reminder that beneath the grand chandeliers, fine clothes, and patriotic speeches of early America, there was a world of horror hidden behind the drapes. One too terrible to name until now. By the time the Civil War loomed over the nation, most Americans had already learned how to look away. Slavery was already a machine, profitable, brutal, and carefully designed to appear civil in polite society. But what history books rarely mention is how this system relied on deliberate silence, especially when it came to the most extreme violations. Castration of enslaved boys was not just a private cruelty, it became a hidden policy of control, one too shameful to be recorded, but too common to be denied. In court records, medical ledgers, and plantation documents, the evidence was never straightforward. But it was there, beneath coded language and missing pages. Phrases like modified servant, incomplete male, or reconditioned boy began to surface in early 19th century estate inventories. Physicians who treated slaves, many of them practicing without ethical oversight, left behind fragmented notes about operations performed in rural settings with altered reproductive function. Some were more blunt in private letters. One Southern doctor wrote to a colleague in 1827, "The child was no longer a danger, and the mistress is pleased. I suspect more houses will require such measures in time." What did that mean? A young boy had been mutilated, likely at the request of the plantation mistress, to eliminate a perceived threat. No name was given, no age, just a line in a letter. That child, like hundreds of others, became invisible. What's more chilling is that this wasn't uniquely American, but America made it uniquely profitable. Slave boys who were castrated and trained for house service could sometimes fetch higher prices at auction. Not always, but often enough that some owners saw it as an investment. One rare ad from 1844 offered a fine mulatto lad, mild-mannered and safe, for an unusually high price. The phrase safe was understood, castrated. And here lies one of history's ugliest truths. Violence was turned into value. Even Northern abolitionists, many of
Subscribe to
whom
my
worked
channel.
tirelessly to expose slavery's evils, often shied away from this particular horror. Why? Because even they understood it might shock people too much. In a world still uncomfortable with discussing sexuality or mutilation, the story of enslaved eunuchs was simply too grotesque, too indecent for public speeches. But for the boys themselves, there was no silence. There was only pain, lifelong. Some who survived the Civil War lived into the 1900s. Many were never recorded in Freedmen's Bureau files. Others appeared in census records as single men, sometimes labeled as invalid, mute, or non-reproductive. These euphemisms masked deeper traumas, psychological isolation, emotional damage, and physical suffering. And in a society built around manhood, virility, and patriarchy, these men were cast out not only by white society, but often by their own communities. Many were denied marriage, fatherhood, or even the right to testify in court because they were seen as less than whole. The worst part, they rarely spoke of it, because how could they? How could a man explain to his children or grandchildren that his body had been altered against his will before he even knew what manhood was? In oral histories, you'll hear things like, he never courted, he stayed in the house, he walked different. The truth sat between the lines. But silence doesn't erase suffering, it only buries it. And now, as we uncover these stories, we must ask ourselves, how many boys disappeared into the system, not because they died, but because they were erased? The castrated slave boys of early America were more than victims. They were witnesses to the darkest functions of power, of white supremacy, of gender control, and of human commodification at its most monstrous. They deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered. And that was the haunting story of the castrated slave boys of early America, a forgotten horror. These weren't just tragic figures lost to time. They were silenced by design. Their stories were hidden between lines, buried in shame, and deliberately excluded from the narratives we were taught. But now, piece by piece, we uncover them, not as statistics, but as human beings whose pain was real, whose suffering was systemic, and whose erasure was intentional. History likes to sanitize itself, but this channel is here to peel back the curtain. If you're tired of the sugar-coated past and want to keep exploring the brutal, raw, and untold stories that shape the world we live in, you're in the right place. So if this episode made you think, or even made you uncomfortable, subscribe, share this with someone who still believes history was civilized, and drop a comment with your thoughts. What other truths do you think have been deliberately buried? Because in the end, history doesn't just repeat, it hides. And here we don't let it.